Hello, myself Durga Prasad. Today we'll be discussing about Integration APIs framework. So, what is Integration APIs framework? Integrations API framework is an application which is built on top of Salesforce to address the client needs, where if a client has a requirement to interact with a SAP system or any other external systems, they need to have a communication that needs to be established between the Salesforce and the external system. That need, this particular application addresses that. In order to address those needs for the integration API framework, we are having the following objects: integration API settings, integration API calls, integration API parameters. For suppose, let me say, if my client is having a requirement to fetch the current weather, so from particular external system. In order to achieve this, initially we need to create a record in the integration API settings. Now let us take a look at the existing record, fetch weather report. So here we have given some details related to the fetch weather report record, where we have given an API setting name as well as is active checkbox checked in, and the record is created. This is the initial integration API setting record. For the integration API setting record, we need to have the integration API calls that needs to be executed when this API setting is called out. For that, we have created an integration API call for this integration API settings. This is how an integration API call is configured. Initially, we have given an API call name and the loop and in the integration API settings where we have configured it with the fetch weather report and endpoint URL. In the endpoint URL, we'll be configuring the endpoint URL in the remote site settings. And if we have an API call sequence, we'll be configuring the API call sequence in the API call sequence field, and what is the type of method or operation that needs to be performed, and if there is a timeout that needs to be happen for that particular API call, we'll be giving certain timeout in the timeout field. So what happens if there are some couple of API calls that needs to be happen for this particular API? Then we'll be having another API call that will be created, and the API call sequence will be 2 for that. And if it is the final endpoint, we will be checking the is final endpoint in the second record. This is how an API call is configured. Once the API call is configured, then we need to pass the parameters for that call to happen. So this is the place where the third object comes into the picture, where we have configured the parameters for the current weather report. So these are the following parameters that needs to be passed when this particular call is called out. So if we see here in the parameters, initially we are having an integration API call field and API parameter name, as well as the type of parameter name and parameter value. And what is the parameter sequence? If we are having 3 parameters, once the first parameter is passed, then only the second parameter will be passed. Similarly, we can configure how many parameters we want in the order which they needs to be executed. This is how an integration API setting record will be created in the front end. For suppose we wanted to call this particular integration API settings. In order to call this integration API settings, we need to define the custom setting record for this integration API setting. So here we have created an integration API framework record for the weather report that needs to be fetched. Here we are having some custom fields that are related to this custom settings record. There, once these required fields are created, then we are having API settings number 1, 2, and 3, where we will be configuring where we will be passing the integration API setting record name and in the order which they needs to be executed. For suppose we are having two integration API setting records which needs to be executed when this custom setting is called out. In the API settings number 1, we'll be passing out the first record name, and in the API settings number 2, we'll be passing out the second record name. Once this is configured, we need to pass this custom setting record name in the Apex class. So whenever a call is happened in the Apex class through a button click or any other operation, and once this custom settings record is invoked, then it will validate the record and it will check for the API settings which are available in the custom setting record. Once the API settings records is fetched, then it will look for the API setting record whether it is active or not. If the record is active, it will try to fetch the API calls for that API settings record. And once the calls are fetched, what are the parameters that are needs to be passed when this call is executed? So once all these operations are done, a response from the external system will be returned to us. This is how the integration API framework. If you see in the real time, let us say as per our scenario, we wanted to fetch the current weather. So let me click on the get current temperature. What happens here is on button click, it will call the custom settings record, and in the custom settings record, it will try to look for the integration API settings, and there the call out happens and the response will be returned back to the component. This is how the integration API framework works. Thank you.